Welcome to our webinar this morning and this afternoon in the UK. Niva Miles is going to be delivering a session focusing on human and social biology, specifically school-based assessment. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to write them in the chat box. And if you do have any questions towards the end, Niva will hopefully be able to answer some of those questions. I will pass it over to Niva now. Thank you.
Thank you, Raina. Right. Well, I think one of the first things that everyone needs to actually appreciate is that it's very important that you're using the 7th edition of our textbook. It matches the new syllabus exactly, both in content and order. And we've been very careful to take out topics that are no longer necessary. For example, they no longer need to do the nitrogen cycle. The ear is missing in any detail from the nervous system section. And those are quite big topics for students to learn and then not get tested on. So it's very important that they actually you look and perhaps offer them the syllabus too, so that they can check what they actually have to learn. The textbook has many features, new features, and they're designed to engage and encourage students to work both in groups and individually. It's full of details relating to the new SBA, with advice on choosing topics and how to write the report, and I'll expand on that as we go through the presentation. We've been very careful to write the chapters on the SBA very much guided by what is in the syllabus. And so we've put the introduction to the school-based assessment, and the whole chapter 18 is about the school-based assessment. And we've sort of turned it into student speak from the syllabus, as you will see there, explaining it's a personal research project, that the teachers will be guiding them. And that's a very important factor throughout this chapter, that students must keep going back to their teachers to check, because you'll be the ones that can actually advise on improvements and so on. They have to do a health-related or environmental issue, and they have to look at the socio-economic impacts in your particular territory. So it should be very much designed for your region, and students will obviously be more au fait with what happens in their own area rather than the wider region in the Caribbean. We tell them that it tests their skills, application, evaluation, and problem solving. And throughout the book, these particular skills are highlighted and in some cases practiced in the activities. So the idea is that although the SBA is at the end of the book, really the skills should be learned throughout the work that they do. And the book contains many activities and the project boxes, etc., which will guide them in some of these skills. As normal for all the SBAs, I think, across the subjects for CXC, the SBA is 20% of the total marks. And so I suppose in theory, you could say, well, we could justify spending 20% of our teaching time on the SBA as opposed to just teaching the normal content. But in practice, I know that many teachers are very, very short of time when trying to get through this syllabus. It's a very big syllabus to get through, and you do need several hours a week to do it. It's difficult at the moment. I know if many of you are still working online. I'm not sure what the situation is in every region, whether you're back in the schools now and actually face-to-face with your candidates. But we do have another webinar. Excuse me. We do have another webinar which relates to blended learning. So if you haven't seen that, that might actually help you if you're still working from home. So the introduction to the SBA, I've mentioned, it's 20% of the marks. The other way you could look at this is, okay, if it's 20% of the total marks, it's 20% of the time. But actually that can be done largely at home by candidates, and therefore it can take 20% of the pressure off teaching the main content. It'll be up to you how actually you manage that. Now, what we've got next is the, I'll find it now, the components of the SBA. This is repeated later on when we go through some of the syllabus statements, but you can see what's required. It's possible that it's very similar to some of the SBAs that you do in other subjects, but of course it's rather different from biology, for example, where the SBA there is largely based on classroom experiments. This is very much working outside the normal classroom. You'll see that there are 10 components, and I think if you work through these methodically with your students, that they will know what's required of them when they're actually writing their report. And they can do each component in turn as you're working through. Right. Now, the book has many activities which help to guide through the student through the various topics. And the first activity in chapter 18 is actually getting ideas for the SBA. So this might be something you want to draw their attention to, perhaps in the middle of the course or maybe even earlier, depending on when you want to start them. And the suggestion is that they go through the project topic boxes in chapters 1 to 17 and look for subjects or suggestions that might actually interest them. And then they have to think of a variation on that. So I'll show you what those are first. You can see that we've got a huge number of topics here. Skills, very important. So we start, how do you present data in tables, present information for discussion, how can you design a visual presentation, how do you use bar charts and pie charts, and how do you actually draw them and consider constructing them. And then how to ask the embarrassing questions. There are ways, obviously, getting around asking. You can't go up to somebody and say, well, are you fat? Do you think you're fat? That would be really rude and actually very embarrassing. But what you can do is say, do you mind if I measure your height and weight? And then, of course, you can actually calculate BMIs, and you don't actually have to ask that question, but you can use the background information when you're designing your survey questions. You can use controls and experiments as one of the other skills. That's largely down to looking at some of the classroom experiments, of course, but it can be modified to say, well, if you're doing something experimental for the SBA, then of course you can modify our advice. Moving on to chapter 6, where I think we've got enzymes using line graphs, and there's a brief description on the best way to present a line graph. Some of these things you would expect to be learned by this year, but actually a lot of weaker students are lacking in confidence about how to do these various things, and it doesn't hurt to actually remind them. And then we've got lots of topics. You can see them there: breathing rate, why do people start smoking, blood donation, investigations with breathing rate and pulse rate, and so on. A huge number of topics. And at each one, what we've tried to do is not only make suggestions about the topics. We haven't given titles, but we made suggestions of areas that they could investigate. And what we've done in many cases, at the end of each of those project boxes, we've actually reminded them of the key points needed actually for an SBA. So we need to know a little bit more about how we can get ideas. And the activity I showed you before refers them to the project boxes, but then suggests other ways that they can get some of the information. Obviously, discussions with you as teachers or with family members, with friends, little focus groups within the classroom and so on, can often prompt a student to think, oh yeah, that's a good idea, and have their own ideas on the topic. We've reminded them they must always check with you, and hopefully if it's a good idea, then you can start the investigation if you approve it. We've sort of suggested that they write down everything they can think of, even if they sound silly, because that can actually be a very good way of coming up with a good idea. I think it's what they probably do in a lot of these advertising agencies. Everyone starts with just saying whatever comes into their head until a bright idea surfaces. So we've said, okay, then if you are stuck, you could look at the Global School-Based Student Health Survey, or you could look at the other websites as we've suggested. As we've said on other occasions, we try not to give the actual links in the book because these can change and things disappear and it can be very frustrating. But I think some of these particular websites are fairly safe to find. So we've got Toxtown, we've got the World Bank with lots of useful resources, health challenges in the small island developing countries of the Pacific and the Caribbean, for example. And the University of Pittsburgh has some examples of environmental and social issues. We remind them that it has to be their own work. So even if they do the project work as part of a group, you can use or adapt a sample survey. They have to use or adapt whatever the group has done and write it up, obviously, themselves. And they're reminded that if they use a sample survey, they should actually record the source in their bibliographies. So here's one of the project boxes, just to give you an idea. It's one of the shorter ones, and it's linked to why do young people start smoking, and you can see it gives them an opportunity to conduct a survey to either smoking or vaping, and they could design a survey to find out what motivates people. We've suggested what they could include. I won't read them all, but you know, the sort of thing, at what age did you start smoking, that sort of thing. And they could actually try to find out a little bit more about why young people start smoking. Are there ways that we could perhaps avoid them starting smoking, and so on. And there's some ideas there, probably taken from the 6th edition, actually, as to the sort of pressures that young people feel when they do start smoking. And then we've, right at the end of that, combine your survey data, think about suitable methods to display them, etc. Discuss your results and try to draw conclusions. So there's already, even though it's an early chapter, there's already guidance on what's going to be required actually in their assessment. This is one of the skills topics. You can see that we've just guided them through drawing graphs and how to display their data graphically. And there are lots of ways that they can practice this, of course. The enzyme experiments are good ways to actually put a table of results and then transfer that into a line graph. And they're advised on how they should actually do that so that it's clear. Some of the topics are actually very sensitive, and I've put in this part of a project box just to show you that we are ourselves very sensitive to some of the issues that young people will come across in their region, and how they are dealt with in different regions can be very different. So the chapter on reproduction offers actually quite a lot of suggestions and ideas on the sorts of things that they could survey. We've suggested here several issues that they could think about. Because they're sensitive, we've said that they should always seek your advice. They should never just go ahead and get on with something, go out and talk to people without knowing what they're doing. And we've said also, you can't ask questions and seek opinions if people would prefer not to talk about these issues. So even though they might be interesting and important, they need actually to collect meaningful data. So they've got to be very careful about what they are likely to ask. Their report has to be valid, of course. So some of the issues we've thought about, would women consider using the new alternatives to different traditional menstrual care products? And in the book, we've got alternatives of reusable sanitary products. And we've suggested it might actually be quite surprising that older women will have used some of those when in their younger days by making their own pads, for example, out of recyclable material. We've looked at the effects perhaps on period poverty, which is a modern issue. Opinions of different types of contraception, and that may well be one where you need guidance in your own area about what you're likely to expect from them or allow them to ask, for example. Availability of sexual health advice, etc. Views in the community on abortion. And again, that's quite controversial. So it needs very careful handling, and you may prefer actually to avoid that. But there are ideas there that they could perhaps investigate. And we made the point that it's unethical for an untrained researcher to investigate people's actual experiences. What they must do is ask for opinions, not ask people whether they use certain types of contraception, but what their opinion is on different types of contraception, for example. And then again, at the end of that little section, a reminder about what is required in the SBA: research the background, collect data, analyse it, present it appropriately, discuss the economic and social impacts, outline how it affects the person personally, and discuss what can be done to improve matters. So each time a project appears, a reminder, well, this is what you need to do for the SBA. So, as it were, stay on track. Excuse me. Now, there are many common research methods they can use, and in the textbook, we've outlined these. I think you can see them quite clearly there. Observation, of course. One that is more likely to affect these particular students with the questionnaires and surveys. And in a moment, I'll show you an activity where we actually teach them what is meant by open and closed questions. They could do interviews. They could look at a focus group idea, which I know some subjects use. And then they can do media and documentary research. And of course, one of the big problems these days is actually using the right media, that they need to be sure that the facts and the opinions and the evidence on environmental or social issues are actually correct. And so it's very important that they don't look at rather bizarre entries and comments on social media, and they are guided to very good sites for information. And you may need to actually monitor the sorts of things that they're looking at, because I think it's one of the problems, as you'll see later, of some of the reports that are sent in, that the actual evidence they've used is rather weak, and they need to have strong evidence in their research. And investigations, of course, largely I would suggest are for the sciences, physics, chemistry and biology, because they'll actually do an experiment. But there are 1 or 2 experiments in human and social biology. For example, the reaction time one, which we use as an example in the book. But on the whole, most of the experiments are not suitable for an SBA. So you have to decide whether, well, I mean, an enzyme experiment, for example, generally will not be suitable for human and social biology SBAs, even if it's suitable for biology. But you might find that the effect of exercise on breathing rate and pulse rate could actually be converted into an SBA by collecting that sort of data and relating it to a particular factor. So a student could relate recovery rate, for example, to a BMI, and that would link 2 parts of their syllabus together, and would actually be relatively easy and not too time consuming to do, for example. The book actually takes each of these methods and gives far more detail so that they actually understand what's required for each part of the book, for the SBA, I beg your pardon. Here's the activity on open and closed questions. You'll see that we start off with what they are. They can be closed questions, can be answered quickly. They don't encourage extra discussion, whereas an open question always requires a longer answer. And we give clear examples of those so that when they're designing their survey, if they're doing one, they should actually be able to include both types of question and understand the difference between the two. I hope you can read this clearly. So, for example, do you like bananas? Yes. But why do you prefer ripe bananas to green ones? It's much more open, and you'll get a longer answer, of course. I quite like the one, why did you buy a red sweatshirt and not blue? Well, I prefer blue, but the red one was in my size, and I think a lot of us fall into that trap. But it gives an explanation and much more understanding of what's going on in that responder's mind, isn't it? And then they're asked to look at pairs of questions, identify open questions and closed ones. There then is a suggestion that you change the closed questions into open ones. So are you feeling better today? Yes. But how are you feeling today, of course, will allow the person to give you far more detail. It can be opening a can of worms, of course, so you have to be careful how long the answer is going to be. And then finally, there's a statement, a vegan diet is healthier than a balanced diet containing meat. And they're asked to write 3 closed and 3 open questions to find opinions on that statement. For those who haven't been with us before, all the activities have the suggested answers online for teachers to check whether they're on the same line as we are thinking. So throughout the book, every activity, and it is packed full of them, will have the answers online for you to check back. Now, this is actually taken from the syllabus. And you'll see that the syllabus statements are very clear. What does it do? It provides an opportunity to individualize part of the curriculum to meet the needs of the students. Sounds quite grand, but actually it's really straightforward in that you choose a topic, the student works individually, and they try to develop the skills that are required. I think the second statement is actually quite important, the fact that it facilitates feedback to the student, so that it gives you an opportunity to chat to a particular student about their work while they're doing the SBA. And of course, you can help to build their self-confidence as they proceed. I have made a few suggestions about how you could keep records really of all of these situations. If a student has a dedicated file for their SBA, they could have a front page where you, at some point, you'll put the calendar. And I would suggest that they actually have a copy of that part of the syllabus. They have a copy of the marking criteria. And as they're going through, it'll be quite satisfying for them to actually tick off the parts of the SBA that they've already completed, and they can see what they've done. And it motivates them perhaps, and they might even find that quite satisfying. You'll see that the CXC statement is that they want them to have a significant and unique contribution to developing the skills. And so the SBA is actually doing that, and it rewards the students for developing the skills rather than just them not knowing, in fact, whether they've got developed skills, and then they enter an exam and all they're required there is to actually remember the knowledge largely, but maybe they don't realize that they've developed a lot of life skills during the course of the SBA program. And the guidelines and the syllabus are there to assist not only the students, but the teachers. And I think it's really important to keep going back to the guidelines. I think it's difficult sometimes to remember that the advice is there. If we keep reminding ourselves that actually we're not working on our own, we're not in limbo, that it's been thought through, that the syllabus is there to guide us as well as our students. We've actually copied a lot of the directly the statements in the syllabus into the book, so that we match the advice and guidance actually in the book. And you can see here that the book has given the various components of the SBA in a straightforward way, based on what's already written. And they have to remember that it's a current health-related topic or an environmental issue, and they have to consider the socio-economic impacts in their territory. So not worldwide, but in their territory. And the expectation is they can collect data, analyze it, and interpret it, and then provide recommendations. So those are the basic things they have to do. And the 10 key points are given here again. So points 5 to 10, as you can see, and a reference to the book, as well as the earlier reference to page 34 in the syllabus, so you know where to find things. And I think it's quite clear that if they know they've got to put the data into 2 forms to get the 2 marks or whatever it is, then they'll know they've got to perhaps do a table and a graph. Or they can find suitable graphics, sometimes photographs, sometimes extracts from newspapers even, which would possibly be considered to be an appropriate form for particular data. They've got to be able to analyse it, of course, and you can see the key things that they have to do. A quick reminder of how the report is formatted. It's got to be presented electronically, and it should have the following components in it. Now, I'm not sure exactly how things work with you, whether you mark on this actual script or whether you have to keep a separate marking plan for each SBA, or whether you can actually show your marking on the script that's submitted. If you can do that, that will actually help tremendously when the moderators are looking at the your marking and comparing it with their suggestions. As I understand it too, you will get lots of extra help from the exam board, that you should have development sessions on what they're expecting, how to do these things. But I haven't had access to any of those yet, so I expect you'll have your own timetables. But it's very important, I think, that you find out what the up-to-date advice is on any school-based assessment, so that any changes that might be made you're aware of before your students actually do the work. Now, here's the beginning of the assessment criteria. And to me, this would be my starting point when I come to mark, when I come to advise students. And it's almost, if you like, that the I won't say the Bible of the SBA, but it's really, really important that you follow the guidelines through the marking criteria. I'm always shocked that some teachers don't seem to have access to all the things that they need, i.e. the syllabus, the assessment criteria, and even the reports that are sent back to schools after particular examinations. It's really important that you read the reports so that students don't keep making the same errors. And it's only a suggestion, but what you could do is you could have a spreadsheet, or you could have a Word document with columns. And for each candidate, you could have the assessment criteria at the front of their file for their SBA, and columns to show a tick that they've completed a particular part, and then another column with perhaps comments where you could write down, this is what you need to do to improve the mark. Look for some other information, make sure your information is relevant. And that can help, particularly when you're guiding them through and you haven't got a lot of time with each candidate. But what you can do is jot down suggestions as to what they need to do next. Because if they don't have a written point to refer to, they'll forget what you say, and they'll forget what's missing in their report and so on. So it's, you know, just a quick idea of what they need to do next in the last column, and they can look at it and say, oh yeah, I didn't do that bit, I better go back and find out some more. Might help them. It might feel like a lot of work to start with, but once you've got a basic outline, you can just copy it for each of your students, and then they can put it in the front of their file. I think giving the students the actual criteria is really important. Many people don't. They don't want to, if you like, burden their students with it. But I think it can help to give them confidence that what they're doing is at least on the right lines. So those are the first few criteria, as you can see. What they need to do for the background, how to get full marks. They've got a detailed description perhaps, but the background lacks some clarity. So they still get a mark for that. But if they don't write a background, it's important you don't try to find a mark that might match. If it's not there, it's not there. And this is the one advantage, I suppose, of writing the report in the correct sequence, is that actually if you use the headings, background, and then you know where to look for the information and the student knows actually where to put it. Apologies if I'm teaching some teachers who've done this for years, but there will be less confident teachers. There'll be teachers new to HSB, and there'll be some teachers absolutely new to teaching here. So I hope everyone at least will get a small amount of help from this discussion. You can see that when you look at the problem statement, there's 2 marks for it, separate marks this time, not, if you like, a graded marks in the background. they first of all must state the problem clearly, and then the statement is actually in an appropriate form. So they can still get a mark if they haven't got the form quite right. But, you know, in your notes, you can say, go back and think about making an observation or asking a question, and you'll get the other mark. Obviously, we can't tell them what to write, but we can ask them to improve what they've written. The research objective, you can see the marks given there. And most marks, as you would expect, are given for the methodology. So the sample is clearly identified and described, gets the 2 marks. And it's clear to me how I should be marking that, because there's 1 mark for identifying the sample, a 2nd mark for clearly describing it, and so on through the methodology. And even at this stage, they're asked to give 1 limitation of the method. It's given here rather than perhaps in the reflection part, or how they could improve things. But I think that that's something that could be missed if you're just going through quickly, when they're going through quickly, they're writing it up, and they forget to write a limitation. Every mark counts. The presentation of the data, as you'll see, they've got to use 2 forms. Tables, graphs, and charts are the likely forms, obviously. Right, we'll move on to the, beg your pardon, I moved on too fast. And then the other half of the mark scheme, and interestingly, you'll see that the analysis, of course, is 5 marks, but the other high scoring area is the reflection, 6 marks there. And I found it a little bit difficult to interpret this, so I think probably CXC will give you more guidance as to the actual statements that are going to be accepted there. So 2 lessons learned after undertaking the project. It could be interpreted, and my first reaction was, well, is it a lesson learned by the student about the way they work? But actually, I think it's probably more to do with what's been learned about the particular project, i.e., is it the environmental issues or the health issues that have actually been learned? And this is something that you need to discuss not only with the students, but also with other teachers and how they would interpret that. But I think what you need there is what the student has learned that they didn't know before they started their actual project. And then, of course, you actually then take that into, well, how has it affected or could be applied to their personal life? So if it's a health issue and they've learned something about diets that would actually reduce BMI and make them more healthy, it could be something they'd say, well, I eat far too much prepared food or whatever it is, and I would think it was important to increase the fruit and vegetables in my diet. That might be a lesson that they might be able to apply. One way the project could be improved, that will very much depend, obviously, on their project. And then 1 social and 1 economic impact that the issue has brought out. Could it have an impact in the school or the community if it's not rectified? And there are so many issues now that students would be concerned about, and this might apply. We've suggested health, diet, and so on, but you've got the problem of pollution, plastic pollution. In the book, we're using the example of excessive pollution from a waste tip, but there could be all sorts of issues in local area that might impact on the school or the community. The layout of the report is actually quite important. And you'll see there what's expected again and how the marks are allocated to that. So there's actually only 1 mark for consistent use of correct spelling and grammar, which may well be a benefit to many students, because if they don't do their spell checks properly, they are going to get spelling mistakes or the wrong word in places. And that's perhaps something they need to learn to do, is to proofread their own work to make sure it actually says what they intended. So often we type, don't we? And there's some very bizarre words put in the place of something we thought we'd written. They have to do a bibliography so that they can accredit the sources that they've used, obviously, for the project. And there's a mark actually given for that, as well as having all the other elements of the report. We've got 2 example assessments in the book. And I suppose the key thing is we didn't want to put a perfect one in, because who knows what perfect actually is. If I'm marking something, there'll always be 1 or 2 points there which are more subjective, and you say, well, I might have given that, but actually compared with what other students have done, it's really not as good, and so I'm not going to give the mark. And this is where moderation comes in, is that they see a large range of examples. They see from a whole, plethora of students from different schools and so on, and colleges. And so it might be that something they see in the marking there and say, they've given the mark, but actually it's not really as good as we were expecting for this mark. And so occasionally people will disagree on the marking. Hopefully, if you follow the criteria very strictly, you'll be as close as possible to the moderator. What we've done in our examples is follow the numbering of the criteria that we've talked about earlier. And we've also given 1 example, which is, if you like, the first example a student would submit and how they should improve it. So the format looks rather unwieldy, I suppose, to start with. But the idea is that on the left-hand side in the yellow boxes, there are lots of ideas, and this is only the beginning of the example. But for example, the title's too vague. Does the waste away dump affect students' health? The actual example is based on the fact that some students walk past the waste away dump to school, others walk from the other direction. And the student thought that her friend who walked past the dump had far more coughs and colds than those that didn't walk that way. And so that set the trigger in motion. Does it affect students' health? But that's actually a really vague title. It's not a very good question, because, in fact, they're only basing it on certain types of health. And so we've made the suggestion that they improve it. I can see in the book that the improvement is... Right, we changed the title. Does air pollution from the waste away dump affect students' respiratory health? And so there are 2 extra things there. The fact that it's air pollution, not groundwater or anything like that. And we want to concentrate on the idea that student was coughing. And so we're talking about respiratory health. And then when they give the background, there are things that are obviously relevant, things which are not relevant. So there's a little bit there in the original statement. The students obviously done a bit of work, talked about greenhouse gas emissions and so on, but that's not relevant to this research question. So in fact, we've highlighted in grey there all the bits that are not really relevant to this particular example SBA, and so they should be taken out. Now, since the number of words is very important, you can see how much could be taken out from the introduction before they even get started. And what we've done, we've gone through a whole assessment. You really need the book to see how the assessment has been set out. We've shown the tables, we've shown the surveys, we've shown the results of the surveys and the appendices and so on. And for each stage, we've suggested how it could be improved. And then, in fact, we've given, if you like, the amended version, the edited version, so that they can see how much better it looks. Maybe not perfect, but certainly a lot better. And the activities we suggest is that they actually look through, there we go, I've got the final version here. We look through the SBA's examples, and we suggest that students mark both the beginning version and the final version to see how many marks extra it's likely to have had. And then the suggestion is, well, could you improve it even further? And we're nearly there. The book suggests a possible timeline. My argument would be that whenever you start the SBA and you give students deadlines for certain parts, I would suggest you keep the deadlines as short as possible. Obviously, it's got to be manageable for you because it's depending on the number of students. But if you give people long deadlines, they wait until the last minute anyway. I mean, I do that with my writing, and I find that if I've got a short deadline, I get on and I do the job. And I actually like to work systematically to short deadlines, and a lot of students will too. And it will teach them, won't it, how to stick to deadlines. Whereas if you've got a long gap, you'll be reminding them every week, now, have you started this, or have you done that part of it? Have you done what I suggested last week? Give them a short deadline, and you're more likely to come up with positive results as they're doing the work. And we've suggested these times, but it will largely depend, obviously, on the way your particular school or college is organised as to how to fit everything in. It might be possible to let them do part of the work in the summer break. Personally, I don't like that because it sort of interrupts their relaxation time, but it could be possible for some of the SBA titles that's actually the best time to do it. So again, it will very much depend on your particular circumstances, and you can see what we've suggested there. And the book goes through the various terms and suggests what might happen in that time. I thought you might like to see, if you haven't seen it already, why teachers award higher marks than examiners in their reviews, in their when they're moderating. It's actually taken from the 2020 report from the independent review team, and you can actually find that easily online. It's obviously based on not only CSEC, but also CAPE exams, and it's general advice. It's not based on particular subjects. So if you read these through, the first one is a little bit worrying. The lack of thoroughness and vigilance by teachers while marking the SBAs. And we can get around that by actually going through the criteria very rigidly. And in some cases, it leads into the award of full marks for areas that students did not even attempt. Now, actually, that's not right, is it? Because if they haven't attempted it, it should be fairly obvious to you when marking. And it should also be obvious that if somebody reads it, they're going to spot that particular part of the SBA is not there. So that's something we can look out for. That the projects actually were inconsistent with the expectations of the scoring rubrics and the requirements of the syllabus. And I think perhaps I've gone over that now, suggesting that you not only have the syllabus in front of you, or so do the candidates, but also that they have marking schemes, so they know exactly what they have to do. The overuse of informal sources from the internet, which detracted from the quality. And I think, again, I commented about the danger of letting them free to pick up anything from the internet without knowing that it's actually valid information, and that they should be guided as to the sorts of sources they go to. I mean, there might be times, of course, where they're looking for bizarre opinions about a particular topic, but they mustn't make it look as though these are the real facts. They must actually make it clear that these are bizarre opinions. I suppose the attitudes to vaccination could be one of those. And finally, the misguided belief that the moderators would be inclined to reduce teachers' marks, and that some element of mark inflation would protect their students from falling below their expected grade. I think when you read the report, one of the things that comes out is that the mark given for the SBAs is very much higher percentage-wise than the marks that particular candidates gain in the actual exam. Now, you would hope actually that they would do better in the SBA, since it's something they're doing long-term and in the classroom with you. But in fact, there is a sort of expectation that if they do really, really well in the exam, then they are likely to do really, really well in the SBA as well, and write a very clear, good report. And if they are very weak in the exam, the suggestion is that perhaps they are likely to have written a weaker report. Now, in many instances, that may well be true. Occasionally, you will have a student who's not confident in exams who actually provides a very good report. And if it's good, it gets the marks. And so I wouldn't worry about that. But I think that the suggestion that you should not inflate their marks is a good one, because that's actually going to cause the moderator to mark everybody down if they only do a sample. So I hope some of that advice has helped some people, and I hope some of it has actually helped you all. But if there are any questions, then please ask them now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Niva, for that fantastic presentation. Just having a look to see if there are any questions. One question that's come in is, which referencing styles are students expected to use?
From what I can see, if it's not actually in the marking criteria, that they could, during the actual report, reference the appendices, which they will have at the end. So if, for example, there's a correlation of all the survey results in Appendix 3 or whatever, then they would refer to that actually in their script. I presume that it might be a good idea sometimes to back up a statement that they make, particularly in the reflection part, that they might back that up with something that they have read elsewhere. But the mark scheme doesn't suggest that they should have references all the way through. Certainly they should refer to their own appendices. They must have a bibliography which has been clearly written with all the background information. We've given an example using our own book and one internet source, and one other I used a paper that I found on the internet about waste disposal and so on. So, you know, that I think, again, might be something that you should ask the exam board what they expect. But there's nothing in the mark scheme that says references are accurately given, as far as I can see. Let's have a quick look. No, it doesn't really say anything about references as such. But again, I think you do need to talk to the exam board about that to make sure that we haven't missed that point.
Sure. Another question, how many objectives should they have?
For the SBA, I think the main objective is to get a really good question at the start and something that they can work on. And I would suggest as simple as possible. Our second example SBA is actually based on reaction times. We've suggested something that they could do quite quickly. They may not get very high marks depending on the way they write it, but they could certainly do something like test reaction times. And we've suggested using something like the traffic light systems on the internet. Somebody presses a button. And the idea there is that not like many of the science investigations where perhaps you play music to see the reaction time, or you have some other background noise. What we've suggested is that a student spotted that parents didn't react very well when the baby cried or there was shouting in the car, and did this change their reaction time? So it's slightly different from the usual way, but they can do that reaction time experiment quite quickly, and the experimenter just lets them try it several times, and at some point shouts something like, "Oh, by the way," and just to see if that actually causes a problem. So one main objective I would have suggested. I can see people are asking, where can we access samples of the SBA? Well, again, I would suggest it's largely with the exam board if they have examples, because this is a new one. Somebody has mentioned earlier that it's quite right. It sounds more like social sciences, but they do have to base it on the knowledge they've got from this particular syllabus. So although some of the recommendations at the end might well be more social, if you like, it is based on knowledge from the syllabus, and that's the key thing here.
Great. We'll just go to one final question. So there's two questions. My students were looking at Form 5 knowledge and practice at home waste disposal. Does this have to be put into a question format or as an observation of a situation for the problem statement?
I think if you look at the syllabus, it actually says either make a statement or of a problem or an observation. It's given there as an alternative at the beginning in the syllabus. So either of those. Somebody else has suggested, can they work in groups? And again, in the syllabus, it actually says that they can collect data in groups, but they must then write that data up and all around the data in their own style. So it's very clear. But the actual book does give two possible examples. I mean, to be honest, I picked the one on reaction time because it's a very common thing that people do when they're doing science fairs and so on. And it's become less, if you like, interesting for people. But it is one that you can find information on, and it can be done very quickly. But probably the observation about a student coughing when she walks past the waste dump is a much better idea for somebody who thinks, oh, yeah, how is that related? Right, what can we learn about this? So, there are two types of investigation offered in the book. And as I said earlier, there are lots of suggestions throughout the book. I showed you the list of the project topics. It's actually packed full of ideas if you read through them first. I think for teachers, you're probably using perhaps the 6th edition still, and you really need for yourself to see the 7th edition so that you can see just how well supported the new syllabus and particularly the SBA is in the new book.
Perfect. Just to add a comment, if you have any questions regarding sales or the publication of the book, please email us and we will do our best to answer any questions. If we haven't had time today to answer any of your questions, or if you would like to know about the sales of the book in your region, then do contact us on our caribbean@macmillaneducation.com email address. And the webinar will be available via email within 2 weeks, along with a PowerPoint presentation. The CPD certificate will be provided automatically as soon as the webinar ends. And also do follow us on social media. So just to say, please do email us if you do have any questions, and we'll do our best to answer those when we have some time, as the webinar is now about to finish. So just to say thank you so much to Niva again, and to the attendees for joining. And we look forward to seeing you in an upcoming session soon. Take care for now. Bye.
Bye, everyone.